On the 13th of December 1945, a young 22-year-old woman shuffled into an execution chamber. Her legs and arms were shackled, and she was helped up the 13 steps of the wooden scaffold and onto the gallows. Stood there was a large executioner, a man much bigger than her, and he held a noose in his hand which he passed over the crossbeam. He then asked her for any final words. She said, "Schnell," giving the executioner one final instruction and command, telling him to get things over and done with quickly. With great haste, the executioner then placed a white cap over her head so she could not see the final moments of her life, and then the noose was secured around her neck. He then released the trapdoor, and the woman referred to as the beautiful beast crashed straight through the trapdoor of the gallows, and a loud snap was heard. Irma Grese was one of the most harrowing women of the concentration camps of World War II, and her name, still 80 years on, carries a sense of dread and fear. But why was witnessing her execution much worse than you would probably have imagined? Irma Grese fell into the lure of the Nazi Party. Her father was allegedly anti-Nazi, but she decided to join the youth groups for teenage girls, such as the League of German Maidens. This upset her father, but her later work inside the concentration camps would push their relationship to breaking point. She did not have the greatest early life. Her mother died after discovering her father's affair, and Irma left school at 14 to work at a dairy factory. She held other jobs, including a shop assistant, but she then wanted a career as a nurse. But this choice was skewed by her Nazi mentality. She didn't apply to work in any hospital, but she became an apprentice aide to an assistant nurse at the Hamelin Sanatorium, a place where SS officers received treatment after being injured on the front lines of World War II. But she was let go from this in 1941, and the SS doctor in charge, Karl Gebhardt, the personal doctor of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, gave Irma Grese a reference to use to possibly work inside the concentration camps. When she was 18, she applied to work as a concentration camp guard inside of Ravensbrück, an all-female camp near to Berlin. She completed her 3-week training, and she demonstrated brutality, which was completely shocking. She was at the time not even 20 years old, and she would then go on to work inside of Auschwitz, after the camp was expanded to include a specific women's camp. Irma Grese became known for her brutality, and overseeing the punishment detail, she patrolled with a pistol, and she would shoot inmates at random. She was also a deviant, and abused many prisoners sexually. Prisoners referred to her as the beautiful beast or the blonde angel, and she wore expensive perfumes to torment the prisoners who were living in complete filth and who were suffering physically. Former inmates claimed that she was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Her face was an angelic clarity, and her blue eyes were the liveliest and most innocent eyes imaginable. Another said it defied belief that such a pretty girl could be so cruel. When she walked through the camp with a whip in her hand, she was surrounded by a cloud of choice perfume. Irma Grese would take things further, and batter and beat prisoners to death with her truncheon. She also walked around on patrol with dogs that had been trained to maul and attack prisoners on command, and at times these beasts killed some of the inmates while others watched. She enjoyed shooting prisoners in cold blood, and one of her favourite things to do was to order the women inside of her barracks to strip, and she then whipped them. One of her biggest offences was in taking part in the selections at Auschwitz. She patrolled the arrival yards when the trains came in, and selected women to be sent to their deaths for any reason. Jealousy played a big part, and if she thought an arrival was more beautiful than her, she would have them gassed instantly. Grese also had many affairs with other guards at Auschwitz, and abused prisoners who were kept like slaves until she became bored. One of her favourite things to do, though, was to watch doctors perform medical experiments and operations. One doctor claimed that Grese kicked the women who were being operated on, and she even became transfixed by what she was seeing, almost in a trance. She was evacuated from Auschwitz in January 1945, and she eventually arrived at Bergen-Belsen, an overcrowded, sorry state of a camp in which thousands of corpses lay everywhere. Even in the final days of Belsen, as the site was close to liberation, Grese demonstrated unbelievable cruelty. But as the site was liberated, the British came across this young woman in her 20s, dressed in a uniform, and whom the prisoners described as a complete sadist and brute. They could not believe what they were hearing, but Grese was in no mood to apologise for her crimes. She was cold and arrogant, and when she was brought to trial, she passed the blame to the head of the SS, Himmler, saying that Heinrich Himmler is responsible for everything that has happened, but I suppose I am as much to blame as the others above me. At the Belsen trial, Grese showed no emotion, except when her sister gave a character witness testimony. Alongside many of her fellow guards, Irma Grese was sentenced to death on day 54 of the Belsen Trials. When she was informed that she was to be executed by hanging, she showed no emotion at all, but when she was taken back to her cell, it was claimed that she was found crying in fear in private. She applied for clemency, but there was no chance for mercy, despite the fact she was just 21 years old at the time. On the 8th of December 1945, months after the end of World War II, Grese and the other condemned guards were moved to Hamelin Prison, where there was an execution chamber created for the Belsen executions. Days before the executions were due to take place, Grese had a knock on her cell door, and she was led towards a room where she first met with British executioner Albert Pierpoint. Pierpoint, who was a master of using the long drop gallows method, recorded her height and weight, and then worked out the drop required to snap her neck instantly. Pierpoint said of this moment that she walked out of her cell and came towards us laughing. She seemed as bonny a girl as one could ever wish to meet. She answered O'Neill's questions, but when he asked her age, she paused and smiled. I found that we were both smiling with her, as if we realised the conventional embarrassment of a woman revealing her age. Eventually she said 21, which we knew to be correct. O'Neill asked her to step on the scales. Schnell, she said. Quick, get it over. On the morning of the 13th of December 1945, the Belsen executions began. The first to go through the gallows was Elizabeth Volkenrath, a senior female guard of Auschwitz and Belsen, and friend of Grese. Grese had actually spent the night before singing Nazi songs with the women, and after Volkenrath's execution, Grese was next, and she was fetched from her cell. Now, there were not a huge amount of witnesses inside of the execution chamber where the gallows stood. There were British judges and military officials who were there to oversee the proceedings. Albert Pierpoint personally went to each of the cells to collect the condemned. It was claimed that Irma Grese stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside, and I had to pinion her in the corridor. Follow me, I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. Those being the words of Pierpoint. Her arms had been secured behind her back, and as she was led into the execution chamber, Grese looked at the gallows, and she also looked at the witnesses and officials stood all around. She was probably terrified by what was going to come. One account says that she went to the gallows kicking and screaming, but another claims that she walked very quickly, almost running to the chalk mark on the trap door. Pierpoint then checked her arms behind her back, and he placed a white cap over her head, a hood so she could not see her final moments. After this, the witnesses gasped as they saw the noose Pierpoint had prepared, and he then secured this around Grese's neck and made sure it was tight enough. She then uttered her final words of Schnell, begging Pierpoint to be quick. It was then claimed that the drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes, the body was taken down and placed in a coffin, ready for burial. The execution of Irma Grese was incredibly quick, and despite her brutality, what shocked many inside of the execution chamber was the age of her, and the innocence of her in that final moment. Despite the notoriety, they saw in many of their eyes a beautiful young woman in her early 20s take her final breaths. This for some was distressing, and it summed up the evils of the Nazi Party, how everyone, no matter their age, could be caught up in the terror of the regime. Pierpoint never forgot Irma Grese. As he placed the noose around her neck and pulled the hood down over her face, she allegedly gave him an enigmatic smile, and this haunted Pierpoint. She was just 22 years old when she was executed. Pierpoint had performed his job successfully, and he had snapped her neck instantly, but she was also left for 20 minutes before she was cut down, and the noose would have been swinging from the crossbeam for a few minutes before it then came to rest. Irma Grese was one of the most evil concentration camp guards of the Second World War. She had a victim list in her thousands, and either by her own hand or by sending victims to the gas chambers, many suffered and took their final breaths because of her. But inside of Hamelin Prison's execution chamber, at the hands of a British executioner, Grese herself took her final breaths. Interestingly, her body still remains on Earth, and her remains are buried in a cemetery close by to the prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.